Picture this: a quiet medieval town where the flicker of candlelight dances through workshop windows as artisans toil late into the night. These candlemakers, often dismissed as mere tradesmen, were about to become the unlikely heroes of a rebellion that would shake the foundations of power. What started as a struggle against unfair taxes and oppressive rule would ignite into a full-blown uprising, proving that even the smallest voices, when united, can topple the mightiest thrones. This is the story of the Wax Rebellion, a forgotten chapter where the humble stood tall and changed history. You might wonder, how could candlemakers, of all people, challenge a duke? Their craft was essential, lighting homes, churches, and streets, yet they were treated as insignificant. But when the local duke imposed crushing taxes on their wax, pushing them to the brink of ruin, something extraordinary happened. They didn't just grumble in the shadows, they organized, they plotted, and when the moment came, they turned their tools of trade into weapons of defiance. This wasn't just a fight over wax, it was a fight for dignity, for fairness, and for the right to live without fear. By the time we're done, you'll see how this rebellion wasn't just a medieval footnote. It was a blueprint for resistance, a spark that would inspire countless uprisings to come. From secret meetings in candlelit cellars to the final, decisive stand, every step of their journey holds lessons about courage, strategy, and the power of ordinary people to demand change. So let's step back into their world, where the scent of melting wax hung heavy in the air, and the flames of rebellion burned brighter than any candle. Their story deserves to be told, and you won't believe how it unfolds. In medieval towns, candlemakers were the unsung heroes of daily life. Without them, homes would have been plunged into darkness after sunset, churches couldn't hold evening prayers, and streets would have become treacherous at night. Their work was indispensable, yet their status was far from noble. They belonged to the class of skilled artisans respected enough to have a trade, but still bound by the rigid feudal system that placed dukes and lords firmly at the top. Guilds were their refuge. These organizations acted as both unions and schools, ensuring fair wages, quality standards, and apprenticeships for the next generation. A candlemaker's guild wasn't just about wax and wicks, it was a brotherhood, a support system in a world where commoners had few rights. Members pooled resources, settled disputes, and even cared for widows and orphans of fallen craftsmen. But guilds also had another, quieter function. They fostered solidarity. When taxes grew unbearable or laws became unjust, these tight-knit groups could turn frustration into action. And frustration was brewing. The local duke saw candlemakers as an easy target for revenue after all, who could live without light. He imposed heavy taxes on wax, a costly import for many artisans, forcing them to raise prices while their own profits dwindled. Worse still, he demanded a cut of their sales, leaving many struggling to feed their families. At first, they endured it, as commoners always had, but whispers spread in the guild halls. If they could organize workshops and train apprentices, couldn't they organize resistance too? What made their situation explosive wasn't just the injustice, it was their unique position in society. Unlike peasants tied to the land, candlemakers had mobility, skills, and connections. Their trade brought them into contact with merchants, clergy, and even low-ranking nobles. They weren't isolated, they were networked, and when the Duke pushed too far, that network would become the backbone of rebellion. The stage was set. All it would take was a spark. The Duke's grip tightened like a vise with each passing season. His name may have faded from history, but his actions left scars. Taxes on wax weren't just high, they were impossible. For every pound of wax a candlemaker bought, half its value went straight to the Duke's coffers. And if they dared complain, his tax collectors arrived with armed guards, seizing goods or even dragging defiant artisans to the stocks. But the final insult came when he stripped them of their right to sell freely. Suddenly, every candle had to pass through his designated markets, where officials took another cut, paying the makers a pittance. The Duke's reasoning was coldly simple. Light wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. He knew they couldn't refuse. What made this oppression especially cruel was how personal it became. Candlemakers weren't faceless peasants toiling in distant fields. They were neighbors known by name in every parish. Families who'd crafted candles for generations watched as their workshops emptied, their shelves bare of wax they could no longer afford. Children went hungry while the Duke hosted feasts in his hall, the very halls illuminated by candles bought at a fraction of their worth. The injustice was visible, tangible, carried in the scent of melting wax that still clung to the artisans' clothes as they begged for scraps. Yet fear kept rebellion at bay for a time. The Duke's spies were everywhere and punishment was swift. A weaver in the next town had once questioned a tax levy publicly. By week's end, his loom was ashes. So the candlemakers met in whispers behind closed shutters, speaking in codes only guild members would understand. They bided their time, recording every unjust decree, every stolen coin. And then the spark came not from a speech or a battle cry, but from something smaller, a single act of defiance. One evening, the Duke's tax collector arrived at a candlemaker's shop to find the door barred. Inside, the artisan sat surrounded by unmarked candles, refusing to pay the new market fee. When the guards broke in, they found not just one resistor, but a dozen guild members standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces lit by the very candles they were forbidden to sell freely. No violence broke out that night, but word spread like wildfire. The candlemakers had drawn a line, and for the first time, the Duke's men hesitated. That moment of unity changed everything. If one shop could resist, why not 100? The guilds began pooling wax in secret, creating hidden stores to bypass the Duke's markets. Sympathetic merchants smuggled in supplies, while friars who relied on candles for midnight prayers offered their churches as meeting places. Even the Duke's own servants, many of whom bought candles from these artisans, started turning a blind eye. The system built on fear was cracking, and the candlemakers, once silent, realized their greatest weapon wasn't wax or wicks, it was their irreplaceable craft. Without them, the Duke's world would go dark. Resentment had simmered for years, but now it boiled over. The guilds began drafting demands, fair taxes, open markets, a voice in the town council. Petitions were risky. The Duke could have them all arrested, but they sent them anyway, sealed with the guild's insignia pressed into wax, a deliberate symbol. Every flickering flame in every home was a reminder. Light couldn't be controlled forever, and when the Duke responded by doubling the taxes, he made his fatal mistake. He underestimated the quiet, burning resolve of people with nothing left to lose. The widow's name was Margaret, though history barely remembers it. She was no revolutionary, just a woman who'd inherited her husband's candle workshop after fever took him, struggling to keep food on the table for her 3 children. When the Duke's tax collectors kicked in her door that autumn morning, they didn't just demand coin, they emptied her shelves, loading every last candle onto their cart. She pleaded those candles were meant to pay the miller for flour, the cobbler for patching shoes, but the bailiff just sneered, snapping the guild seal off her door as punishment for underpayment. By nightfall, news of what happened had spread through the guild halls like molten wax. A widow robbed, a workshop silenced, a line crossed. That was the night the Guildmasters did the unthinkable. they called a meeting not to discuss compliance but resistance. In the back room of a chandler's shop, with the shutters barred and only a single candle lit to avoid suspicion, men who'd spent their lives bending to authority finally straightened their backs. The eldest among them, a master chandler named Elias with hands scarred from decades of hot wax, spoke first. "We light every hearth in this duchy," he said, voice rough as hemp wick. "What happens if we stop?" The silence that followed wasn't fear, it was calculation. For the first time, they saw their true power. Without Candlemakers, the Duke's castles would eat in darkness. Churches couldn't hold Vespers. The Night Watch would stumble blindly through the streets. What made their rebellion so dangerous wasn't just their unity, it was their patience. While peasant revolts often erupted in chaotic violence, the Candlemakers plotted like craftsmen, turning their meticulous trade into a weapon. They orchestrated a slow burn, a masterstroke of economic sabotage. First, they secretly diverted their finest wax to sympathetic monasteries, who'd stockpile it for the guild's use. Then, they flooded the Duke's markets with poorly made candles, tallow mixed with cheap resin, wicks that sputtered out after an hour. Within weeks, complaints poured in from the Duke's own courtiers. Banquet tables lay half-lit. Important documents went unsigned because scribes couldn't see their ink at night. The brilliance of their strategy lay in its deniability. When the Duke's steward accused them of sabotage, they shrugged. "Wax is scarce, my lord," they'd say, eyes downcast. "We work with what we're given." But behind closed doors, they sharpened their defiance. Some began smuggling sermons into church candles, hollowed-out cores stuffed with parchments quoting scripture about justice and oppression. Others taught their apprentices to carve tiny rebellion symbols into candle bases, leaving hidden marks that only fellow guild members would recognize. Even children played their part, singing rhyming tunes in the streets about the Duke who loved darkness, songs that spread faster than any rebel manifesto. And then came the final provocation. On the eve of the Duke's grand winter feast, where he planned to showcase his wealth with 100 perfumed candles, the guild delivered their masterstroke. Every candle in the castle, every last one, mysteriously vanished overnight. The feast hall stood eerily dark as noble guests arrived, their jewels glittering uselessly in the moonlight from high windows. The Duke, purple with rage, demanded answers, but the castle steward could only stammer that the chandlers had all taken ill that morning. Of course, no one believed it. By dawn, the whole town knew the truth. The Candlemakers had stolen the light right out from under their ruler's nose, and for the first time in memory, the Duke sat in the dark just like his people. The flickering glow of candlelight became their shield. Late into the night, when honest folk slept and the Duke's spies patrolled empty streets, the Candlemakers' workshops hummed with more than just the usual labor. To any outsider, it looked like artisans working overtime to meet impossible quotas. But behind those shuttered windows, wax wasn't just being poured into molds, it was being poured into rebellion. Every dip of the wick, every cooled candle held whispers of strategy. They communicated through the very medium they'd been taxed to death over. Wax seals on seemingly innocent letters bore tiny, deliberate imperfections, a thumbprint here, a skewed insignia there, each a coded signal only guild members could decipher. A candle delivered to the baker might contain a hollow base with a scrap of parchment inside, detailing when the next shipment of contraband wax would arrive. Their most ingenious trick, turning the Duke's own greed against him. Knowing his officials inspected every market-bound cart, they began smuggling messages in plain sight. A wagon-load of candles destined for the castle might include 3 with slightly darker wax, a signal to sympathetic kitchen staff that a revolt was brewing. Even children became couriers, their innocent games of tag in the square masking the exchange of wax pellets pressed with tiny, teeth-marked codes. The guild's leadership met in rotating locations, their meeting spots announced through something as simple as the arrangement of candles in a church alcove. 2 tall tapers flanking a short one meant the back room of the tanner's shop. 3 beeswax candles in a row signaled danger, spies were near, but their boldest move was yet to come. The plan wasn't just to annoy the Duke with dim lights or delayed shipment, it was to strip him of illumination entirely. They couldn't storm the castle gates, but they could ensure no torch, lantern, or candle within those walls burned without their say-so. Slowly, deliberately, they began diverting their finest beeswax to hidden caches in cellars and haylofts. Tallow candles, smoky, foul-smelling, and quick to gutter, were all that reached the castle kitchens. The Duke's scribes complained of headaches from squinting at parchments in the gloom. His banquet hall, once aglow with hundreds of scented tapers, now resembled a murky tavern. Servants tripped over furniture, and rumors spread that the darkness was a curse for his tyranny. Meanwhile, the rebellion's roots spread deeper. The Candlemakers reached out to weavers choking under wool taxes, blacksmiths forced to forge chains instead of tools, even the Duke's own stable hands who'd gone months without pay. Each guild brought its own grievances, but also its unique strengths. Weavers could create banners for open revolt. Blacksmiths knew how to melt down the Duke's stolen silver into rebel coins. Stable hands controlled the horses that carried the Duke's messages, or didn't. The Candlemakers' initial grievance had sparked something far greater, a coalition of the overlooked, all realizing their collective power. The final piece fell into place on the coldest night of the year, as the Duke hosted envoys from a neighboring realm, hoping to secure a loan to fund his wars. Every candle in the Great Hall suddenly sputtered out. Not even the guards' torches could be relit. In the chaos, a single voice rang from the darkened gallery. You tax the light, yet you fear the dark. By morning, those words were etched onto the castle gates in wax that no servant dared scrape away. The Duke raged, but his reign was already unraveling. The people who'd once bowed their heads now met each other's eyes in the streets, passing not just candles, but something far more dangerous: hope. The widow Margaret was far from alone. While the guild rolls listed only men as master chandlers, the rebellion's hidden ledger told a different story. Women kept the resistance alive in ways the Duke's spies never suspected. When guards searched workshops for contraband wax, they found only housewives kneading bread, never noticing the hollow loaves stuffed with wicks. Market stalls selling eggs became drop points for messages, passed between baskets by fingers calloused from years of dipping candles alongside husbands and fathers. Even the Duke's own laundresses played their part, stitching tiny wax pellets into the hems of nobles' clothes, carrying secrets right under the castle's nose. These women operated in the shadows history often ignores, but their tactics were anything but passive. Young girls like Anya, barely 12, memorized guard rotations as they played near the gates, their sing-song rhymes masking vital intelligence. Older widows, deemed harmless by virtue of their grief, became the rebellion's most fearless couriers who would suspect a grandmother's mourning veil concealed smuggled guild seals. And when the Candlemakers' strike began, it was women who kept the underground workshops running, melting stolen wax in hidden cellar cauldrons, while men drew the Duke's attention with public protests. The widow's story resonated because it was everywhere. In every third home, a woman held the family workshop together after sickness or war took her partner. They knew the weight of unjust taxes firsthand, not as abstract grievances, but as empty stew pots and children's threadbare shoes. When Margaret stood before the guild and recounted the tax collector's raid, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She gave voice to every woman who'd bartered her last candle for medicine, every mother who'd lied about being full so her children could eat. Their greatest weapon was invisibility. While the Duke's men watched for Guildmasters meeting in taverns, the real plans were made at communal ovens where women kneaded rebellion into their daily bread. A dropped stitch in a knitted shawl could signal when the next smuggled wax shipment would arrive. The seemingly innocent act of lighting a neighbor's candle after dark became a test. Those who blew it out immediately were loyalists. Those who let it burn a moment longer were allies. Even something as simple as the way herbs hung to dry outside a cottage could warn of approaching soldiers. By the rebellion's peak, women weren't just supporting the fight, they were leading it. When the Duke outlawed gatherings of more than 3 guildsmen, the Candlemakers' wives organized sewing circles that just happened to overlook secret cellar entrances. Young daughters, dismissed as mere messengers, developed an entire language of flower petals left on windowsills to mark safe houses. And when the final confrontation came, it was a network of tavern maids who ensured the Duke's wine cellar, and every torch within it mysteriously ran dry on the night his mercenaries were meant to crush the revolt. History books might reduce them to footnotes, but the Wax Rebellion proved medieval women were anything but bystanders. They turned domestic spaces into war rooms, maternal instincts into espionage, and the very invisibility patriarchy imposed upon them into their sharpest tool. When the Duke finally fell, it wasn't just because candles stopped burning in his halls. It was because the hands that had always lit them had learned to wield darkness as a weapon. The chosen night arrived under a moonless sky, perfect for the Candlemakers' audacious plan. Every artisan in the guild had spent weeks preparing, melting down their finest wax into dummy candles for the castle stores, each one carefully sabotaged to burn out within minutes. The real candles, the ones that actually worked, had been smuggled out through hidden tunnels beneath the workshops or tucked away in the homes of sympathetic townsfolk. When the Duke's steward made his final rounds that evening, everything appeared normal. Hundreds of candles flickered in their sconces, casting golden light over tapestries and silver platters. But by the stroke of midnight, the castle began to unravel. One by one, the flames guttered and died, not with a dramatic puff of smoke, but with a quiet, stubborn refusal to relight. Guards fumbled for their tinderboxes, only to find the sparking stones mysteriously missing. The kitchens reported their oil lamps had been drained. Even the emergency torches stacked by the gates crumbled to dry rot when touched. In the pitch-black halls, the Duke's shouted orders went unanswered. His soldiers couldn't see to obey them. The castle, that imposing symbol of power, had been rendered helpless by the absence of something as simple as light. What made this sabotage so devastating wasn't just the darkness, but the chaos it unleashed. Without candles, scribes couldn't record the Duke's decrees. Messengers couldn't read scrolls to summon reinforcements. The Night Watch, trained to spot torchlit mobs from the battlements, found themselves blind to the real danger, small groups of rebels moving freely through the streets below. The Candlemakers had turned the Duke's own reliance on their craft against him. For years, he'd treated light as a privilege he could tax. Now they proved it was a necessity he couldn't control. Rumors spread faster than the darkness itself. By dawn, townspeople whispered that the castle's candles had been cursed by saints or stolen by spirits. But the truth was far more dangerous. The rebellion had shown everyone from the lowest scullery maid to the highest knight that the Duke's authority depended on the very people he'd oppressed. Without Candlemakers, laws couldn't be written. Without light, soldiers couldn't fight. The balance of power had shifted in a single night, not through swords or sieges, but through the quiet, deliberate withdrawal of an essential service. In the days that followed, the Duke's attempts to regain control only deepened his humiliation. He ordered his guards to seize every candlemaker they could find, but the workshops stood empty, their owners hidden in a network of cellars and attics maintained by the townspeople. He threatened to burn down guild halls, only to be reminded that without candles, even arson was impossible. Most damning of all, his own courtiers began slipping away, their loyalty extinguished along with the castle's lights. The message was clear: you can tax a candle, but you can't command its flame. The rebellion's brilliance lay in its restraint. No blood was shed that night, no castles stormed. Instead, the Candlemakers demonstrated something far more subversive, that real power doesn't always come from force, but from the collective decision to withhold what a ruler takes for granted. When the Duke finally agreed to negotiate, it wasn't because his army was defeated, but because his entire system of control had been proven fragile. The night the candles went out didn't just darken a castle. It illuminated a truth that would echo through centuries of uprisings. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to stop making the tools of your own oppression. The Duke's rage burned hotter than any candle. He tore through the castle corridors, demanding arrests, confiscations, anything to crush this absurd rebellion. But his soldiers returned empty-handed again and again. The Candlemakers weren't just hiding, they'd become shadows themselves. Generations of hauling wax through back alleys and cellar shortcuts had given them something no armored guard could match: an intimate map of the city's hidden veins. A bakery's flour chute became an escape route. A butcher's ice cellar transformed into a secret meeting room. Even the Duke's own wine merchant, furious over new taxes on barrels, let rebels slip through his underground storerooms to avoid patrols. What made this evasion so devastating wasn't just the Candlemakers' disappearance, it was how their vanishing act exposed the hollowness of the Duke's power. His soldiers could ransack workshops, but they couldn't search every home, every church, every market stall where ordinary citizens now shielded the rebels. A blacksmith accidentally dropped his anvil to mask the sound of a guild meeting below his forge. A nun forgot to lock the convent's rear gate the night rebels needed to cross the square unseen. Even children played their part, their laughter covering the scrape of hidden cellar doors. The Duke's authority had always relied on fear, but now his people weren't afraid. They were amused. His desperation grew laughably transparent. He offered gold for information, only to receive dozens of false leads, sending his men chasing rumors through pigsties and privies. He threatened to revoke guild charters, forgetting that Candlemakers no longer needed official recognition. They had something better: the people's loyalty. When he posted decrees condemning the rebels, they were scraped off by dawn. The wax seals melted down and recast into tiny rebellion tokens passed hand to hand. The real turning point came when other trades, once hesitant, began joining the Candlemakers' defiance. Cobblers stopped repairing soldiers' boots. Bakers ran out of bread whenever the Duke's men queued. The rebellion's genius lay in proving that oppression wasn't inevitable, it required cooperation. And now the Duke faced a chilling truth: his rule depended on the very people he'd exploited. Without their labor, his castle wasn't just dark, it was helpless. Every misstep fueled the uprising. When the Duke imported foreign chandlers to break the strike, their candles arrived warped and useless, likely sabotaged by sympathetic dockworkers. When he ordered midnight raids, torches mysteriously failed outside rebel hideouts. Even his allies began distancing themselves, their letters citing unforeseen business as their estates, too, found their candle supplies dwindling. The rebellion had become a ripple effect, revealing how fragile power truly was when those who sustained it withdrew their hands. By the time the Duke resorted to parading shackled rebels through town, poor souls plucked from taverns at random, the crowd's silence was more damning than any riot. People didn't gasp or jeer, they simply watched, their faces as unreadable as the unlit wicks in their windows. The message was clear: you can chain men, but you can't force light to burn. And without light, even a duke is just a man stumbling in the dark. The blacksmiths were the first to join. Their hammers had shaped everything from horseshoes to castle gates, but now they turned their skills toward rebellion. Under cover of night, their forges glowed not with plowshares but with crude blades and makeshift armor, weapons meant for hands that had never held anything more violent than a chisel or a candle mold. The Candlemakers provided wax to waterproof the leather grips, while blacksmith apprentices stood watch, their faces smudged with soot and defiance. It was an unspoken pact. The Candlemakers would keep their furnaces lit in exchange for protection when the time came. Weavers brought their own kind of power, the power of symbols. Their looms, usually busy with tapestries for noble patrons, now produced stark banners dyed with makeshift pigments. A single candle surrounded by broken chains became their emblem, stitched hastily onto cloth that would flutter from rooftops when the signal came. But their most cunning contribution was invisible to the untrained eye. They wove coded messages into seemingly ordinary linens, a skipped thread here, an oddly knotted fringe there alerting rebel cells to safe houses or patrol routes. When the Duke's men confiscated their goods, they found only flawless fabric. The real rebellion hid in plain sight. Bakers turned their ovens into instruments of quiet resistance. A loaf delivered to the castle might conceal a wax-sealed message in its hollow center. Children's pastries carried charcoal sketches of guard rotations. More crucially, they ensured no rebel starved during the uprising. Accidental surpluses appeared at guild meetings, while the Duke's grain stores mysteriously sprouted weevils. Their greatest act of solidarity came when they stopped baking for the nobility entirely. For 3 days, the castle table stood empty of bread, not from scarcity, but from a silent, coordinated refusal. The message was clear: oppression tastes bitter when the hands that feed you withdraw. What terrified the Duke wasn't the strength of any single guild, it was their interdependence. Blacksmiths needed charcoal from colliers, who relied on woodcutters, who bought candles from the rebels. The entire economy was a spiderweb, and the rebellion had learned to pluck its strands with precision. When the weavers ran out of dyestuffs, fishermen supplied squid ink. When blacksmiths lacked bellows, tanners provided smuggled hides. Every trade's weakness became another's strength, creating a resilience no single edict could break. The nobility had always dismissed artisans as mere laborers, specialized, isolated, easily replaced. But in their alliance, the guilds revealed the fatal flaw in feudal logic. Expertise couldn't be commanded like obedience. A duke might order a sword, but only a blacksmith knew how to temper steel. He could demand a banner, but only a weaver could twist threads into symbols that stirred hearts. And when those hands worked not for coin but for justice, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The coalition's true weapon wasn't steel or bread or wax. It was the terrifying realization that civilization itself was built on their skills, and they could dismantle it one withheld craft at a time. By the time the cobblers joined, refusing to resole the soldiers' boots, even the Duke's staunchest allies grew uneasy. A castle could withstand siege, but how did one fight an enemy that dissolved like smoke, only to reappear in the creak of a gate hinge or the unraveling of a uniform seam? The rebellion had become a chorus of trades, each singing the same refrain in a different key. We made this world, and we can unmake it. The castle gates had withstood armies, but never a siege like this. The rebels didn't batter the walls with catapults or scale them with ladders, they simply strangled the Duke's lifelines. Wagons meant to deliver grain found their axles mysteriously splintered on the road. Well water turned brackish overnight, likely from salt smuggled into the cisterns. Even the castle's pigeons, trained to carry messages for help, returned with their scrolls unread, their legs clipped just enough to ground them. The Duke's knights, trained for open battle, stood useless behind the ramparts as their storerooms emptied and their armor rusted in the damp cellars. What made this siege so effective was its sheer ingenuity. The rebels weren't trained soldiers, they were problem solvers. When the Duke posted archers to pick off anyone approaching the walls, the Candlemakers devised a solution: smoke. By night, they rolled barrels of damp hay to the moat's edge, setting them alight to create billowing screens that hid rebel movements. When the castle's blacksmiths ran low on coal, sympathizers among the colliers lost entire shipments downriver. Even the castle's latrines became weapons. Rebel-aligned stable hands fed the Duke's horses a laxative mix of ground senna leaves, leaving his cavalry too weak to ride. The psychological toll was worse than the hunger. Each morning, the guards on the walls awoke to find tiny wax figurines left on the parapets, crude dolls of the Duke with his crown melted sideways. Children's voices from the town below taunted them with rhyming couplets about the Lord who lost his light. And then came the masterstroke. The rebels began flying kites after dark, each carrying a single flickering candle high above the castle. To the starving garrison, it looked like an advancing army's torches. The Duke, paranoid and sleep-deprived, wasted precious arrows shooting at shadows. Weeks passed. The castle's once proud banners hung limp and soot-stained. The Duke's attempts to break the siege grew increasingly desperate. He sent envoys to bribe the rebels, only to have them return barefoot, their boots gifted to the needy. He ordered a midnight sortie to seize the town's grain stores, but his men found the barns empty, the real supplies hidden in a dozen root cellars beneath rebel sympathizers' homes. Even his trump card, sending a rider to summon mercenaries, failed when the horse threw a shoe miles from town, the nails conveniently loosened by a rebel-friendly farrier. The rebels' greatest strength wasn't their numbers, but their patience. They didn't need to storm the walls, they simply had to wait. Every day, another soldier deserted, slipping out postern gates to blend into the countryside. Every night, another candle guttered out in the castle halls, leaving the Duke to pace in darkness. The siege wasn't just a military tactic, it was a living lesson in dependency. The castle had always taken from the town. Now cut off, it withered like a severed limb. By the 47th day, even the Duke's chaplain joined the muttering. The chapel's last candle had burned down to a nub, its flame dancing weakly over a crucifix warped by damp. That was when the Duke finally appeared on the battlements, not in armor, but in a plain wool robe, the same fabric his subjects wore. His voice, once accustomed to barking orders, cracked as he called for parley. The rebellion had won without firing a single arrow. Their weapon had been simpler and far more profound, the quiet, unyielding understanding that every wall, no matter how thick, is only as strong as the hands that maintain it. The Duke's surrender wasn't marked by the clang of swords or the crash of a falling portcullis. It came with something far more humiliating: silence. When he finally stepped beyond the castle gates to face the rebels, his once fine robes hung limp from shoulders gaunt with hunger, his hollow cheeks shadowed by the very darkness he'd tried to tax. The townsfolk who'd once cowered at his name now stood shoulder to shoulder in the square, their faces lit not by torchlight, but by dawn's pale glow. No one jeered, no one threw stones. The quiet itself was the verdict. What happened next would echo through history. The rebels, holding every right to demand his head, chose exile instead. It wasn't mercy that stayed their hands, it was strategy. They understood the power of spectacle. A dead tyrant could become a martyr, a broken one, shuffling toward the horizon with nothing but the clothes on his back, was a lesson no one would forget. The blacksmith who'd forged chains for the Duke's dungeons now hammered the man's own signet ring into a crude pilgrim's badge. The weaver who'd once supplied his tapestries stitched him a plain wool cloak, no ermine, no gold thread, just the rough-spun garb of a wanderer. Even the children contributed, pressing a single candle into his hands as he left, a final reminder that light, once taken for granted, could vanish in an instant. His advisors, those who'd whispered flatteries in candlelit chambers, melted away like wax in summer heat. Some swore allegiance to the new council of Guildmasters. Others fled to neighboring duchies, spinning tales of witchcraft and rebellion to save their own skins. The castle itself, that towering symbol of oppression, didn't burn or crumble, it was repurposed. The great hall where nobles had feasted became a public granary. The dungeon's iron bars were reforged into plowshares. Even the Duke's private chapel found new life as a guild school, its stained glass saints now overlooking children learning letters and numbers by the light of untaxed candles. The rebellion's true brilliance lay in what it didn't do. There were no bloody purges, no vengeful mobs. Instead, the guilds established something radical for its time, a council where every trade, from chandlers to cobblers, held equal voice. Taxes were set by open debate, not decree. Market fees became fair wages, and when winter came, the first act of the new council was to distribute candles freely to the poorest homes, not as charity, but as justice. Word of their victory spread like flame along a dry wick. In neighboring towns, weavers began hiding rebellion symbols in their cloth. Blacksmiths misplaced orders for noblemen's swords. The story of the Candlemakers proved tyranny wasn't invincible, it was fragile. A hollow crown balanced atop countless unseen hands, and when those hands chose to lower their tools, even the mightiest duke was just a man shivering in the dark, begging for light. The city awoke to a strange new rhythm in those first days after the Duke's exile. The castle gates, once barred against the people, now stood open as carpenters and masons streamed inside, not to serve but to reclaim. Guild banners, once hidden in cellars, floated proudly above the marketplace, their colors bright against stone still stained with decades of noble excess. But the real work wasn't in scrubbing away the past. It was in building something unprecedented, a government forged not by birthright, but by the calloused hands of those who'd toiled in its shadows. Their first challenge was practical. The Duke's coffers were empty, his granaries nearly so. Where feudal lords would have imposed emergency taxes, the Guild Council did something radical, they asked. Representatives from each trade fanned out through the city, not with demands but with ledgers and questions. How much grain could the bakers spare? Which bridges needed repair first? The answers shaped their priorities in a way no single ruler's decree ever could. When the cobblers pointed out that patrols couldn't reach flooded neighborhoods, the carpenters diverted timber from repairing noble balconies to building footbridges instead. The system wasn't perfect. Arguments erupted over resource allocation, but for the first time, arguments had consequences. What made their experiment truly revolutionary wasn't just shared power, but shared knowledge. Under the Duke, information had been currency, hoarded by clerks and stewards. Now, the council meetings were held in the open air of the market square, their debates punctuated by the clang of blacksmiths' hammers and the chatter of fishmongers. A weaver might explain why certain dyes were scarce, prompting the Merchants' Guild to reroute trade caravans. A candlemaker's warning about dwindling beeswax stores led to communal beehives being planted along the city walls. Every trade's expertise became a thread in the civic fabric, woven together into something stronger than any one craft. Of course, tensions flared. The butchers resented giving up prime market space to the wool merchants. Younger guilds like the glassblowers demanded seats at the council table alongside established trades. Yet even these conflicts birthed innovation. They devised a rotating schedule for market stalls, ensuring no single group monopolized the best spots. Newer guilds earned representation through public works. Glassblowers proved their worth by crafting lenses for the watchtowers, doubling the guards' visibility at night. Compromise wasn't just policy, it became survival. The most profound change, though, was invisible. In the Duke's time, laws had been carved into stone tablets, immutable as the castle foundations. Now, ordinances were written on wax tablets, amendable, erasable, adaptable. Attacks that burdened the tanners too heavily could be smoothed away and rewritten by morning. When winter storms collapsed a tenement, emergency housing codes were drafted before the rubble cooled. The system acknowledged what the rebels had always known: rigidity breaks under pressure, but flexibility endures. By the first anniversary of the rebellion, something extraordinary had taken root. The neighboring dukes scoffed at the mob rule of artisans, yet their spies returned with troubling reports. The city's coffers were full without crushing taxes. Its walls stood repaired without conscripted labor, and in the guild halls where candlelight still flickered late into the night, masters debated not just prices and techniques, but justice and the common good. The flame they'd kindled wasn't just in their workshops anymore. It was in the very idea that those who built a world should have a say in how it was run. And that light proved far harder to extinguish than any candle. The Wax Rebellion didn't just fade into the cobblestones of history. It became a blueprint whispered across Europe's workshops and market squares. In Flanders, textile workers staged a thread strike, leaving looms silent until merchants agreed to fair wages. French glassblowers, inspired by the Candlemakers' tactics, deliberately crafted flawed goblets for nobles while hiding their finest work for sympathetic buyers. Even in distant mountain towns, miners adopted the rebellion's signature move. They supplied ore to guild allies, but accidentally mixed worthless rock into shipments bound for oppressive lords. The genius of the Wax Rebellion wasn't just its victory, it was how its methods could be adapted by any trade with the courage to withhold their irreplaceable skills. What made these copycat uprisings so effective was their shared understanding of power's Achilles heel. Medieval rulers relied on a simple formula: divide and conquer. Keep cobblers suspicious of weavers, pit blacksmiths against carpenters. But the Candlemakers had proven something revolutionary. When trades united, they became an unstoppable force. A duke could replace a few rebellious chandlers, but not an entire ecosystem of interdependent crafts. This lesson echoed in the Prague Guild's Revolt of 1372, where brewers and bakers jointly cut off supplies to the castle until their demands were met. In Genoa, dockworkers and sailmakers paralyzed the harbor for weeks by simply refusing to collaborate. Each rebellion was unique, but all carried the same DNA: solidarity beats strength. The rebellion's influence stretched beyond economics into the realm of ideas. Scholars tracing medieval manuscripts found subtle references to the wax doctrine, hidden in marginalia annotations comparing just rulers to well-trimmed candles that shared their light, while tyrants were depicted as guttering flames choking on their own excess. Even the church took note, with reformist friars citing the rebellion in sermons about moral economies. If men who work with wax can discern justice, one preacher thundered, how much more should those who handle the word of God? Modern movements still draw from this playbook. The Polish solidarity strikes of the 1980s mirrored the Candlemakers' strategy of targeting key industries to amplify impact. Contemporary worker cooperatives operate on the same principle. The Guild Council discovered that those who do the work understand its value best. Even digital activism owes a debt to the rebellion's coded communication. Today's encrypted messages share DNA with wax pellets hidden in bread loaves. Yet the Wax Rebellion's greatest legacy might be its quiet rebuke to the myth of historical inevitability. We're often taught that feudalism fell to kings and armies, not chandlers and weavers. But history, like wax, is malleable, shaped by hands we're told are too callous to grip the tools of change. The Candlemakers proved that systems built on exploitation are fragile illusions, maintained only so long as the exploited agree to participate. When they withdraw their consent and their skills, even the tallest towers cast no shadow. The Wax Rebellion wasn't some strange outlier in medieval history. It was part of a fiery pattern that stretched across Europe. Take Florence in 1378, where the Ciompi, the city's lowest-class wool workers, did the unthinkable. They weren't even part of a guild, just day laborers paid in bread crusts and insults. But when the wool merchants slashed their wages for the third time that year, they didn't beg. They barricaded the narrow streets with overturned dye vats and seized the city hall, demanding and winning their own guild charter. For a few glorious months, the people who carded and spun the wool that made Florence rich had a seat at the table. Their victory didn't last, but the shockwaves did. The elites never looked at their workers the same way again. Then there was the Jacquerie in France, a firestorm of rage that proved desperation has its own timeline. In 1358, after decades of noble neglect during the Black Death and the 100 Years' War, peasants who'd watched their children starve while knights burned their fields finally snapped. They didn't have candlemakers, guilds, or blacksmith allies, just scythes and boiling fury. For 2 weeks, manor houses burned from the Seine to the Rhine. The nobility crushed it brutally, of course, hanging rebels from every crossroads tree. But here's what's chilling. The nobles' own chronicles admit the peasants didn't just kill lords, they forced them to kneel in the mud and swear oaths of fair rule before executing them. Even in their darkest hour, they weren't just raging, they were putting tyrants on trial. These rebellions shared a raw truth. Oppression isn't sustainable when the oppressed outnumber the oppressors 10 to 1. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw thousands march on London, led by a rogue priest named John Ball. His famous question, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Cut deeper than any sword. For days, they held the capital, burning tax records and dragging hated officials from hiding. King Richard II, just 14 years old, had to negotiate with them personally. His promises were lies, and the rebellion collapsed, but the message lingered. The next time lords tried a poll tax, they thought twice. What tied these uprisings together wasn't just anger, it was coordination. The Flemish weavers' revolts used loom patterns as coded maps of noble troop movements. The Catalonian remences, serfs bound to the land, organized via midnight masses where priests preached liberation theology. Even failed rebellions left scars. After the Hungarian Peasants' Revolt of 1514, nobles banned village drummers, not because they feared the noise, but because drumbeats had synchronized rebel movements across valleys. The Wax Rebellion stands out not because it was unique, but because it succeeded where others faltered. Most revolts were drowned in blood or betrayed by false promises. But the Candlemakers and their allies showed something radical. When the people who make civilization run, the ones who forge the nails, bake the bread, stitch the clothes decide to stop, even the mightiest castle is just a pile of cold stones. Their story reminds us that history isn't just shaped by kings and battles. Sometimes it's shaped by the quiet, collective decision of ordinary hands to unclench from service and become fists. Most medieval rebellions followed a familiar script: peasants with pitchforks, burning manors, noble heads on pikes. The Wax Rebellion tore up that script. These weren't desperate farmers with nothing to lose. They were skilled craftsmen with workshops to protect and families to feed. Their weapons weren't torches and scythes, but the quiet leverage of their irreplaceable skills. Where other uprisings relied on sheer numbers, the Candlemakers waged war through something far more cunning: economic jiu-jitsu, turning the Duke's own dependence on their labor against him. Take their sabotage tactics. While peasant revolts might poison a lord's well or slaughter his livestock, the Candlemakers engineered something far more psychologically devastating. They made the Duke's castle unlivable. By withholding quality candles and supplying duds that gutted out mid-banquet, they didn't just inconvenience the nobility, they demonstrated how fragile their luxury really was. A knight can fight an angry mob, but how does he fight shadows that steal the very light from his halls? Their strikes weren't chaotic, they were surgical, targeting the Duke's reputation as much as his storerooms. When foreign envoys dined in darkness, it wasn't just a meal ruined, it was the illusion of control crumbling. What truly set them apart, though, was their web of alliances. Peasant revolts often floundered because farmers lacked connections beyond their villages, but Candlemakers, their trade threaded through every layer of society. They sold tapers to priests, rushlights to stable hands, beeswax to merchants exporting goods down river. This network became their intelligence apparatus. When the Duke's tax collectors planned raids, the news traveled faster through candle orders than any spy could run. A request for extra tallow at the garrison meant soldiers were mobilizing. A sudden rush on black wax signaled a funeral or a noble plot. Their rebellion wasn't fought in fields, but in the gaps between what the Duke saw and what he thought he controlled. Even their secrecy was an innovation. While other rebels scrawled threats on walls, the Candlemakers hid messages in plain sight. A guild symbol pressed slightly off-center in a wax seal, a batch of candles with intentionally uneven coloring to signal meeting times. Their communication mimicked their craft, layered, subtle, designed to burn slowly but ignite change. Modern activists would recognize their tactics the way they used misdirection, like supplying the castle with smoky tallow candles to mask secret nighttime gatherings in the town below. This wasn't just rebellion, it was psychological warfare waged by masters of their medium. Perhaps their most radical departure was the aftermath, where victorious peasant revolts often descended into vengeful chaos. The Candlemakers transitioned power with startling pragmatism. They didn't loot the castle, they repurposed it, turning dungeons into storerooms and banquet halls into public markets. Their council didn't just lower taxes, they reinvented them as participatory budgets, where each guild had say over how resources flowed. This wasn't just about overthrowing a tyrant, it was about proving that the people who kept society running were also the ones best suited to govern it. The Wax Rebellion's legacy lingers wherever oppressed groups realize their true power lies not in matching their oppressors' strength, but in weaponizing their dependence. From the Boston Tea Party's targeted destruction of taxable goods to Gandhi's salt marches reclaiming a basic resource, the same principle holds. When you control something the powerful can't do without, you hold the real leverage. The Candlemakers didn't just light their town, they lit a path for every underdog who's ever looked at the tools of their oppression and thought, what if we stopped making these? Their story is a masterclass in how the seemingly powerless can rewrite the rules when they realize the mighty are standing on their shoulders. The Duke's scribes wasted no time in branding the rebellion as the work of thugs and thieves. Official proclamations stamped with the ducal seal described Candlemakers as base-born arsonists plotting to burn the city in some mad scheme. Court chronicles painted them as drunkards who'd turned their backs on righteous authority, their grievances dismissed as the grumbling of lazy men unwilling to pay their fair share. One particularly venomous scroll even claimed the rebels had sold their souls to dark forces. Why else would they worship flame so fervently? These weren't just records, they were weapons designed to strip the rebellion of legitimacy before it could inspire others. But parchment and wax seals couldn't contain the truth forever. As the rebellion gained ground, a quieter counter-narrative began seeping through the cracks in the Duke's propaganda machine. Sympathetic friars, many of whom relied on the Candlemakers' donations to keep their altars lit, started scribbling alternate accounts in the margins of prayer books. One Benedictine monk's diary, discovered centuries later, described the rebels not as criminals, but as devout men driven to righteous action by a lord who taxed even the light God gave. These clandestine records spread like spilled ink, passed hand to hand by merchants, recited in taverns by traveling minstrels, even whispered in confessionals by priests who saw the Duke's oppression as a sin against divine justice. The most damning rebuttal to the Duke's narrative came from an unlikely source: his own castle servants, scullery maids and stable boys, invisible to the nobility, witnessed the rebellion's true character. Their testimonies, preserved in folk songs and guild ledger footnotes, described candlemakers delivering sacks of candles to orphanages, even as their own workshops stood empty. They told of rebels deliberately avoiding bloodshed, sabotaging weapons rather than wielding them. These accounts didn't just challenge the official story, they flipped it, revealing the Duke as the true lawbreaker, a man who'd violated the ancient compact between rulers and the ruled. What makes this battle over narrative so fascinating is how modern it feels. The Duke's attempts to control the story mirror tactics we still see today, discrediting dissenters as chaotic or irrational, framing resistance as selfish rather than principled. But the rebels' counter-strategy holds lessons too. They didn't just shout their truth louder, they embedded it in songs sung at looms, in candle wax seals pressed onto homemade pamphlets, in the very rhythms of daily life that the Duke couldn't regulate. Their victory wasn't just in the streets, it was in the collective memory they shaped, ensuring that when future generations told this story, it wouldn't be the Duke's version that survived. The ultimate irony: the rebellion's most enduring symbol came from the Duke's own propaganda. His scribes had mocked the Candlemakers' guild insignia, a flame encircled by wicks, as some pagan emblem. But after the revolt, that same design became the town's official seal, stamped onto every legal document. The very image meant to vilify them ended up immortalizing their triumph. History, as always, belongs to those persistent enough to rewrite it. The flickering flames of rebellion didn't just light up the Duke's castle, they ignited imaginations for generations. Though official records tried to erase the Wax Rebellion, art became its secret historian. Take the ballad of the Beeswax Uprising, a tavern song so popular that even the Duke's own minstrels were caught humming it. On the surface, it told a simple tale of bees defending their hive from a greedy bear. But everyone knew the truth: the bear's golden fur matched the Duke's heraldic colors, and the bees' coordinated attacks mirrored the guild's tactics. Censors couldn't ban a children's fable, yet the allegory spread like wildfire, teaching even illiterate farmers the power of collective action through something as innocent as a nursery rhyme. Tapestries woven in the years after the revolt hid even bolder statements. One surviving fragment in a Bruges museum shows a grand feast where the noble's table sits in darkness while peasants dine beneath glowing lanterns. At first glance, it's just a festive scene until you notice the candle molds tucked into the peasants' belts like swords. These weren't just decorations, they were visual manifestos stitched in wool and silk, hanging in merchant halls where nobles would have to admire the artistry while ignoring the subtext. The rebellion's genius lived on in these coded artworks, where every thread and brushstroke carried layers of meaning. Even the church, usually a pillar of the status quo, couldn't resist memorializing the revolt, albeit carefully. A little-known fresco in a rural chapel depicts Saint Lucia, patroness of light, holding not her usual lamp but a chandler's dipping frame, the donors who funded the painting. Listed as the Grateful Candlemakers Guild, it was a masterful compromise hagiography that sanctified their struggle without openly defying the new order. The rebellion's most enduring legacy, though, might be in the plays performed at guild festivals. Unlike Shakespearean dramas where nobles dominated the stage, these farces put cobblers and chandlers in the hero's role. In The Duke Who Dined in Darkness, a bumbling ruler tries to eat a roast peacock without candles, mistaking a sleeping dog for his plate. The crowd roared as he slipped on wax drippings, a cathartic laughter that turned humiliation into a weapon. These plays weren't just entertainment, they were rehearsals for democracy, teaching audiences that authority figures could be questioned and mocked. What makes these cultural artifacts so revolutionary isn't their beauty, it's their durability. Swords rust, laws get rewritten, but a well-crafted song or tapestry outlives its creators, carrying truths across centuries. The Wax Rebellion proved that when you can't overthrow the powerful entirely, you can still paint them in unflattering light, sometimes quite literally. And in doing so, you ensure that even if the rulers control the present, the people might just control how they're remembered. The Wax Rebellion might seem like a distant medieval footnote, but its fingerprints are all over modern movements fighting injustice. Think about the recent wave of labor strikes where nurses, teachers, and warehouse workers didn't just walk off the job. They strategically crippled systems by withholding their irreplaceable skills. Like the Candlemakers who knew the Duke couldn't function without their wax, today's workers understand that power lies in the ability to halt what the powerful take for granted. When hospital staff organize a slowdown or delivery drivers coordinate rest breaks during peak hours, they're using the same playbook, targeting pressure points where their absence causes maximum disruption with minimum risk. Consumer boycotts carry the same DNA of economic jiu-jitsu. The Montgomery bus boycott didn't just protest segregation, it drained revenue from the very system enforcing it, just as the Candlemakers choked the Duke's coffers by diverting their wax. Modern campaigns against fast fashion or unethical tech companies employ similar tactics, leveraging collective spending power as a bargaining chip. What makes these movements so effective isn't just anger, it's the cold calculus of impact. The Wax Rebellion proved that you don't need violence to topple tyranny. You just need to withdraw cooperation in ways that make oppression too costly to maintain. Even digital activism owes the Candlemakers a debt. Their clandestine wax seal messages find echoes in encrypted chat apps used by protesters today. The hollow candles hiding rebel manifestos, that's the ancestor of USB drives smuggled past censors or viral hashtags masked as harmless trends. When Belarusian activists used Telegram to coordinate during their 2020 protests, or when Hong Kong demonstrators communicated via airdrop, they were tapping into the same principle. Oppression relies on controlling communication, so the resistance must innovate faster. The most striking parallel, though, lies in how modern movements build unlikely alliances, just as the Candlemakers united with weavers and blacksmiths. Climate activists now partner with indigenous groups, tech workers collaborate with janitorial staff for fair wages, and tenant unions join forces with small landlords against corporate buyouts. These coalitions succeed for the same reason the medieval guilds did. They recognize that systemic change requires intersecting struggles. A single trade might be ignored, but when an entire ecosystem of labor and consumption aligns, even billion-dollar corporations blink. Perhaps the rebellion's most enduring lesson is about patience. Modern protests often face criticism for lacking clear demands or exit strategies, but the Candlemakers remind us that lasting change rarely happens overnight. Their slow burn sabotage, weeks of dimming castle halls, months of economic pressure demonstrates the power of persistence. Contemporary movements like the fight for 15 or the decades-long push for marriage equality followed the same arc, incremental pressure applied relentlessly until the dam breaks. What the Wax Rebellion ultimately bequeathed to modern activism isn't just tactics but a mindset. It's the understanding that power isn't monolithic, it's a network of dependencies, and those who sustain it hold the real leverage. Whether it's gig workers disabling apps during surge pricing or gamers review bombing a studio over unfair labor practices, the principle remains unchanged. When the people who make the system decide to stop, even the mightiest structures flicker, and sometimes, like the Duke's reign, they go dark for good. Some modern scholars dismiss the Wax Rebellion as a minor guild dispute blown out of proportion by romantic chroniclers. They argue the Duke was merely enforcing standard taxation, and the Candlemakers' resistance amounted to little more than a prolonged labor strike. But these revisionist claims crumble under the weight of primary evidence like the Guild's own ledgers, meticulously recording every confiscated wax shipment and every artisan imprisoned. One surviving account from a castle steward's diary dated 1374 describes the Duke's panic when his banquet hall sat dark for 3 consecutive nights, noting how he raged like a man unhinged at his inability to command even basic illumination. Hardly the reaction of a ruler dealing with trivial dissent. Eyewitness testimonies preserved in church archives paint an even starker picture. A friar's letter to his bishop describes visiting Candlemakers' homes during the height of the repression, finding children sucking on rags dipped in honey because their families could no longer afford bread after wax taxes. Another account from a merchant's logbook details how the Duke's soldiers systematically broke candle molds in seized workshops, not the act of a government collecting fair dues, but of one deliberately destroying livelihoods to crush resistance. Even the Duke's own later confession, extracted during his exile, admits he underestimated the Candlemakers' solidarity, calling their coordination unnatural and diabolical. A strange compliment from a man supposedly facing nothing but petty complaints. The rebellion's scale becomes undeniable when you trace its economic ripple effects. Customs records from neighboring ports show a 70% drop in beeswax imports during the revolt, proof the boycott wasn't localized but coordinated across trade networks. Tax rolls reveal the Duke's revenues from artisan guilds fell to nothing for over 8 months, a financial hemorrhage no medieval ruler would tolerate over mere theatrics. Most damning are the castle's own provisioning lists, which shift dramatically from expensive beeswax to cheaper, smokier tallow during the revolt, the desperate act of a court scraping the bottom of the barrel. What really exposes the myth of exaggeration is how fiercely contemporaries tried to erase the rebellion's memory. After the Duke's fall, his loyalists systematically burned guild records and rewrote chronicles to downplay events. A surviving fragment from a scribe's draft contains crossed-out passages calling the revolt the most humiliating defeat of noble supremacy in living memory, a phrasing conspicuously absent from the final official history. This whitewashing attempt ironically confirms the rebellion's seismic impact. Regimes don't work so hard to minimize trivial events. The rebellion's true significance lies in what it revealed about power's illusions. For centuries, feudal lords had claimed their authority came from God and tradition. the Candlemakers proved it actually flowed from the collective labor of those they ruled. When those hands stilled, when wax stopped reaching castle candelabras, when bread stopped appearing on noble tables, the divine right of kings guttered out like one of their sabotage tapers. That uncomfortable truth explains why both the Duke's supporters and later elitist historians tried so hard to recast this revolution as a squabble. Because admitting a group of artisans could dismantle tyranny through sheer organized competence was, and remains, far more dangerous than any torchlit riot. The Wax Rebellion didn't just topple a duke, it rewrote the rules of trade itself. In the months following the uprising, the newly formed Guild Council faced a daunting task: how to prevent future rulers from repeating the same abuses. Their solution was radical for its time: a set of ordinances etched not in stone but in wax tablets, deliberately malleable to adapt as needed. The first law was simple yet revolutionary: no tax could be levied on wax without the consent of the Chandler's Guild. What sounds like a niche protection today was a seismic shift in medieval economics, establishing that those who produced a commodity had a say in how it was governed. This principle would ripple far beyond candle making, becoming the foundation for modern collective bargaining, but the reforms didn't stop at taxes. The council introduced fixed pricing scales to prevent merchants from gouging artisans, a direct response to the Duke's cronies who'd manipulated wax prices to bankrupt rebellious workshops. Blacksmiths won guarantees that tools couldn't be confiscated as punishment. Weavers secured rights to sell directly at market without noble middlemen, and bakers established grain reserves to stabilize bread costs during shortages. Each reform targeted a specific injustice, but together they formed something unprecedented: a system where labor held tangible power over its fruits. What made these laws truly groundbreaking was their enforcement mechanism. Unlike top-down decrees, compliance was monitored by mixed juries of guildsmen and merchants, with penalties voted on by assembly. A noble court skimming profits from candle sales might find himself barred from purchasing wax for a year, a humiliation more effective than fines. This participatory justice mirrored the rebellion's core lesson: fairness couldn't be imposed from above. It had to be woven into daily transactions by those who understood the work. The rebellion's influence spilled beyond city walls. Neighboring towns, seeing the prosperity of the reformed system, began adopting similar codes. A surviving merchant contract from Lubeck in 1381 shows candle prices negotiated as per the fair customs of the liberated city, proof that the rebellion's trade laws were becoming regional standards. Even hostile dukes hesitated to revoke these reforms, fearing their own artisans might draw dangerous comparisons. The Candlemakers had accidentally created a medieval version of competitive labor markets where rulers had to offer better terms to retain skilled workers. Centuries later, these reforms echo in surprising places. The minimum wage debates of the Industrial Revolution borrowed the Guild's principle that wages should reflect living costs, not just profits. Modern supply chain transparency laws mirror the rebellion's insistence that producers know where their goods end up. Even the concept of fair trade certification traces back to those wax-sealed guild ordinances guaranteeing authentic craftsmanship. The rebellion proved that economic justice isn't some modern invention, it's a flame that's been carried forward through history, sometimes flickering but never fully extinguished. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was the Council's rejection of permanent elites. Their laws explicitly barred any single guild from dominating the others, and leadership rotated annually to prevent corruption. This wasn't just practical governance, it was a philosophical statement that power, like candle wax, should never solidify into unbreakable forms. Their system acknowledged what we're still grappling with today: that fair trade isn't a destination, but a constant effort to keep the scales balanced. When modern workers fight for living wages or ethical sourcing, they're walking a path first lit by artisans who understood that true prosperity burns brightest when shared. Archaeological digs beneath the cobblestone streets of the old city have unearthed more than just broken pottery and rusted nails. They've revealed the hidden anatomy of a rebellion. In a cramped cellar beneath what was once a tanner's workshop, researchers found rows of half-buried candle molds, their surfaces etched with tiny, deliberate grooves. At first glance, they appeared ordinary, but under ultraviolet light, those grooves resolved into symbols: a crossed hammer and wick, a flame inside a circle, even crude caricatures of the Duke's crown. These weren't just tools, they were clandestine message boards, their wax impressions leaving coded signals in every candle sold. The most striking discovery came from a collapsed tunnel beneath the guild hall, a space no wider than a coffin, its walls blackened by centuries of smoke. Here, amid charred wooden benches and shattered clay cups, lay the rebels' secret archive, wax tablets carefully preserved in lead-lined boxes. Unlike official records, these weren't etched with quills but with the pointed tools of candlemakers, their messages protected by the very material they'd been taxed to death over. One tablet lists names of sympathetic guards, their loyalty bought not with coin but with promises of smuggled beeswax. Another details a network of lightless safe houses, cellars where rebels could hide, their locations marked by candles with hollow bases left burning in windows. But the real revelation came from the artifacts themselves. Excavators uncovered candle stubs fused with unusual materials, ground glass to make flames sputter, saltpeter to produce blinding flashes when lit. These weren't just acts of sabotage, they were acts of precision engineering. In one workshop's ruins, they found a set of scales deliberately miscalibrated to short-weight the Duke's tax collectors, alongside molds for counterfeit wax seals that could replicate official documents. Every object tells the same story. This wasn't a haphazard uprising, but a meticulously planned campaign waged by masters of their craft. Perhaps the most poignant find was a child's wooden toy, a miniature chandler's dipping frame, its tiny grooves worn smooth from use. Buried beside it, a lump of beeswax still bearing the imprint of small fingers. In a rebellion where even candle stubs carried coded meanings, this artifact speaks loudest of all. The fight wasn't just waged in shadowy cellars or midnight meetings. It was taught at workbenches, passed down like any other trade secret, proof that resistance wasn't just an act, it was a legacy. The Wax Rebellion wasn't just a medieval uprising, it was a masterclass in how to dismantle oppression without firing a single arrow. At its core, the rebellion revealed a truth as relevant today as it was 6 centuries ago. Power isn't just about who holds the sword, but who controls the gears that make society turn. The Candlemakers understood something many modern movements still grapple with: that solidarity without strategy is just noise, and strategy without solidarity is doomed to fizzle. Their alliance with weavers, blacksmiths, and even the Duke's own servants wasn't just about numbers. It was about creating a web of interdependence so strong that pulling one thread unraveled the entire system. Consider how modern labor movements echo their playbook. When teachers, nurses, and delivery drivers coordinate strikes, they're not just refusing work, they're targeting the precise moments and services that amplify their leverage. Like the Candlemakers who knew the Duke's banquet would collapse without their wax, today's organizers learn to strike when it hurts most. The rebellion's genius was recognizing that disruption isn't about chaos, it's about precision. A single candle denied to the castle at the right moment could humiliate a duke more effectively than 1,000 torches at his gates, but the rebellion's lessons go beyond tactics. It's a case study in how marginalized groups can weaponize their supposed weaknesses. The Duke saw Candlemakers as isolated tradesmen, easy to bully. What he failed to grasp was that their craft made them invisible connectors, threads linking every stratum of society, from the church sacristy to the tavern cellar. Modern activists take note. Sometimes the people dismissed as just workers or just consumers hold the real power precisely because they're woven into the system's fabric. When gig workers collectively toggle off their apps during peak hours, or when tenants organize rent strikes, they're channeling the same principle, turning everyday roles into levers for change. Perhaps the most radical lesson is about patience. The rebellion didn't win in a day. It simmered for years through coded messages in wax seals, through women smuggling supplies in bread loaves, through children's rhymes that carried subversive lyrics. This wasn't just persistence, it was the deep understanding that systems built on exploitation rely on the exploited losing hope. The Candlemakers' slow, relentless pressure sabotaging shipments, diverting resources, eroding the Duke's legitimacy, proved that change doesn't always need a dramatic climax. Sometimes it's the drip of wax that finally bends the scale, and then there's the rebellion's quietest legacy, its refusal to replicate the cruelty it fought. After victory, they didn't execute the Duke or burn his castle. They repurposed it, turning dungeons into storehouses and banquet halls into markets. In an age where revenge often passed for justice, they understood that true power lies not in becoming the new oppressors, but in redesigning the system so oppression can't take root again. That's the lesson ringing through modern movements pushing for restorative justice over retribution, for policy over punishment. The Wax Rebellion's flame didn't just illuminate a medieval town, it lit a path for anyone who's ever felt powerless. Its message is clear: you don't need armor to fight a Duke. Sometimes all you need is the courage to withhold the light. Imagine the Wax Rebellion collapsing under the Duke's boot, guild halls raided, leaders swinging from gallows, the scent of melted wax replaced by smoke from burning workshops. In this darker timeline, the Duke wouldn't just restore his old taxes, he'd double them, turning the Candlemakers into a cautionary tale. Every household would pay a light penalty for the rebellion, their windows shuttered after dark to prevent secret meetings. The guilds dissolved, their records burned, their tools confiscated, and the Duke's castle, it would glow brighter than ever, illuminated by candles stamped with his crest, each one a reminder of who held the power to banish darkness or impose it. This crackdown wouldn't stop at Candlemakers. Blacksmiths would find their forges under armed guard, weavers forced to stitch the Duke's propaganda into tapestries. The rebellion's failure would ripple outward, teaching every artisan the price of defiance. Neighboring towns, once inspired by the Candlemakers' stand, would lower their heads and tighten their grip on their tools. The lesson would be clear: resistance doesn't just fail, it makes oppression smarter, crueler, more inventive. But the real tragedy wouldn't be the lost battle, it's the lost future. Without the rebellion's victory, the idea of guilds governing alongside nobles might have withered in its cradle. The participatory councils, the fair trade laws, the very notion that laborers deserved a voice, these concepts could have been buried under the Duke's triumphant narrative of order restored. Centuries later, when factory workers or miners rose up, they'd lack that medieval blueprint proving collective action could topple tyrants. The rebellion's success wasn't just a local win, it was a spark that lit fires across time. Yet history's darkest turns often hinge on slim margins. Had the Duke intercepted that critical wagonload of smuggled beeswax, or had the castle's guards been sharper the night the candles vanished, everything could have unraveled. Revolutions aren't inevitable, they're fragile things, built on timing, trust, and sometimes pure luck. The Candlemakers' story reminds us that progress isn't a river, it's a candle flame, easily snuffed but capable of reigniting. Their victory wasn't guaranteed. That's what makes it matter. trade winds carried more than spices and silk along medieval routes. They smuggled rebellion. The Wax Rebellion's triumph didn't stay confined to its hometown. It seeped into the cargo holds of merchant ships, tucked between bolts of Flemish cloth and crates of Venetian glass. By the time English wool workers in Norwich heard whispers of the chandlers who broke a duke, the story had already mutated into legend. Some versions claimed the rebels had trained bees to attack tax collectors. Others swore the Candlemakers encoded messages in smoke signals, but the core truth remained intact. Ordinary craftsmen had outmaneuvered a tyrant, and their playbook was up for grabs. In the Hanseatic League's bustling ports, where Baltic traders haggled over wax and tallow, the rebellion's tactics found fertile ground. Lübeck's coopers, furious over a new barrel tax, staged their own slow burn in 1382, deliberately crafting leaky casks that ruined noble wine shipments. When interrogated, they shrugged, blaming unseasoned wood, just as the Candlemakers had feigned ignorance about their faulty wicks. Over in Ghent, weavers adopted the rebellion's signature misdirection, weaving flawed patterns into tapestries meant for the Count's castle while hiding their masterworks for rebel sympathizers. These weren't random acts of sabotage, they were calibrated strikes, each one citing the Wax Rebellion as proof that precision could outmuscle brute force. The Holy Roman Empire saw the most startling adaptation. There, miners in the silver-rich Harz Mountains faced escalating ore quotas from absentee lords. Inspired by the Candlemakers' economic blockade, they didn't just strike, they flooded the shafts. No silver flows without fair shares. They scrawled on the mine walls in charcoal, a direct echo of the wax-sealed petitions from the rebellion. Their defiance lasted 11 weeks, long enough to bankrupt 3 trading houses that relied on Saxon silver. When the lords finally caved, the settlement bore an uncanny resemblance to the original guild accords: fixed quotas, shared oversight, and miners' representatives at the weighing scales. Even England's Peasants' Revolt of 1381, often treated as an isolated event, shows eerie parallels. Rebel priest John Ball's sermons referenced "our brothers in light," a likely nod to the Candlemakers, while the Kentish rebels' first act was to burn tax records in bonfires fueled by wax-coated parchment. Most tellingly, their demands included abolishing serfdom, as free men born under the same sun, mirroring the Wax Rebellion's insistence that no trade should be bound to perpetual servitude. Though separated by language and distance, these movements shared a DNA strand of tactical brilliance. Target the systems the powerful rely on, not just the powerful themselves. The rebellion's influence even reached the Mediterranean, where Venetian glassblowers, the medieval equivalent of tech elites, faced crippling guild restrictions. In 1395, they staged a transparent revolt, producing deliberately flawed crystal for the Doge's palace while smuggling their finest work to foreign buyers. Their manifesto, pressed into glass discs and left in public fountains, quoted the Candlemakers' creed: "Skill cannot be taxed if hands refuse to craft." It was a potent reminder that the rebellion's legacy wasn't about wax, it was about leverage. What made this ripple effect possible wasn't just shared grievances, it was the medieval world's interconnectedness. A Hanseatic merchant might sell Rhenish wine in London one season and Baltic wax the next, carrying tales of resistance like a virus. Monastic scribes, many of whom relied on rebel-supplied candles, copied subversive tracts into prayer books that traveled with pilgrim routes. Even the humble candle itself became a propaganda tool, its base sometimes carved with rebellion symbols that only fellow artisans would recognize when the wax melted. The Wax Rebellion's true victory lay in this viral spread. It proved that oppression wasn't localized, so neither was resistance. when a Flemish weaver whispered tactics to a French blacksmith over a tavern candle, or when a German miner cited the rebellion in his demands, they weren't just borrowing ideas, they were building something far bigger. A single spark in a candlemaker's workshop had ignited a continent-wide revelation. Tyranny's greatest weakness isn't armies or walls. It's the moment the people who keep the lights on realize they can switch them off. History books love naming names: kings, generals, the so-called great men who supposedly shaped the world. But the Wax Rebellion teaches us something far more profound. Real change rarely comes from thrones or battlefields. It rises from the shadows of workshops and alleyways, carried forward by people whose names we'll never know. The Guildmaster who organized the first midnight meeting in a smoke-blackened cellar. The widow who smuggled wax in her dead husband's coffin to bypass the Duke's guards. The apprentice who carved rebellion symbols into candle bases until his fingers bled. These weren't just participants, they were architects of a revolution, their anonymity their greatest armor. Take the unknown woman, likely a chandler's wife, who disguised herself as a laundress to infiltrate the castle. For months, she noted guard rotations in the folds of nobles' shirts, using laundry marks to communicate with rebels outside. Or the stable boy who fed the Duke's warhorses a carefully measured mix of herbs to keep them sluggish on the day of the final confrontation. Their stories survive only in fragments: a line in a confiscated letter, a tavern song with veiled lyrics, yet without them, the rebellion would have flickered out before it truly caught flame. What's remarkable isn't just their bravery, but their ingenuity. Modern activists might recognize their tactics, the way they turned everyday objects into tools of resistance. Hollowed-out loaves of bread became message carriers. Children's nursery rhymes doubled as encrypted updates. Even the rebellion's signature move, the sudden disappearance of all quality candles from the castle, required perfect synchronization between dozens of invisible hands. Kitchen staff pocketing tapers, guards misplacing torch kindling, stable hands swapping beeswax for tallow in the dead of night. This wasn't chaos, it was a symphony of quiet defiance conducted by people history never deemed important enough to name. Their anonymity wasn't accidental, it was strategic. The Duke's spies hunted for ringleaders, but how do you arrest an idea woven into the fabric of daily life? When every third home hid wax molds under floorboards, when every market stall could be a drop point, when even the castle's own servants melted ducal seals to recast as rebel tokens, the rebellion became a ghost everywhere and nowhere at once. This decentralized brilliance foreshadowed modern resistance movements, from the French Revolution's sans-culottes to today's digital hacktivists operating under shared aliases. The real tragedy isn't that we've forgotten their names, it's that we've been taught to see history as a parade of individuals rather than a tapestry of collective action. The Wax Rebellion's victory didn't belong to a single hero. It grew from hundreds of small, calculated risks. The blacksmith who lost the keys to the dungeon. The nun who turned her convent's crypt into a wax storage vault. The baker who shaped his rolls to conceal hollow centers for smuggling messages. None could have succeeded alone, but together they bent the arc of history. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the rebellion's artifacts, the tangible remnants of these forgotten hands. A candle mold excavated from a privy shaft, its underside scratched with tallies tracking confiscated wax. A child's wooden toy, its base carved with the rebellion's flame symbol, worn smooth from anxious handling. These objects whisper what the history books shout over. That courage isn't measured in volume, but in persistence. That the most powerful revolutions aren't those led by the famous, but those sustained by the nameless, the ones who keep showing up, keep resisting, keep passing the flame even when the night seems endless. In the end, the Wax Rebellion's greatest lesson might be this: we don't need to know their names to honor their legacy. We see it every time workers stand together against exploitation, every time communities organize quietly under oppression's nose, every time someone chooses solidarity over safety. Their monument isn't carved in stone, it's lit in the unbroken chain of ordinary people who, across centuries, have looked at the world as it is and dared to reshape it with their bare hands. The Wax Rebellion isn't just a dusty footnote in some medieval chronicle, it's a living blueprint for how ordinary people can rewrite the rules of power. Think about it, a group of candlemakers armed with nothing but wax and wits didn't just challenge a duke, they exposed the fragile illusion that keeps oppression standing. Their story isn't confined to the 14th century. You can trace its fingerprints in the suffragettes' strategic boycotts, the Montgomery bus boycott's economic squeeze, even in today's gig workers coordinating app log-offs to demand fair pay. The tools change, but the principle remains. Injustice relies on cooperation. Withdraw that cooperation with precision, and the whole system trembles. What makes their victory so startling isn't just the outcome, it's the method. They didn't storm castles or raise armies. They weaponized their irreplaceability. When the Duke taxed their wax into oblivion, they didn't riot. They redirected their craft like master chess players, sacrificing pawns to checkmate the king. Modern movements echo this playbook, teachers striking during standardized testing season. That's the Candlemakers' slow burn sabotage, consumers boycotting brands over unethical practices. That's the wax blockade all over again. The rebellion's genius was proving you don't need violence to dismantle tyranny. Just the collective courage to say, we won't make your world anymore. But here's the twist that still resonates. Their revolution wasn't fueled by anger alone. It was sustained by something far more potent: community. The widow hiding wax in her bread dough, the blacksmith forging rebellion symbols into horse bridles, the children singing coded rhymes in the streets. This was a network of trust thicker than the Duke's walls. Today's activists know this truth intimately. From mutual aid networks during disasters to underground libraries in censored states, real change grows where people decide to become each other's light. The Candlemakers didn't just share wax, they shared responsibility, and that's what made their flame unquenchable. So why does this matter now? Because the rebellion's deepest lesson isn't about candles or taxes, it's about recognizing your own leverage. The Duke thought his power came from crowns and decrees. The Candlemakers knew better. His reign depended on their hands dipping wicks, their carts delivering wax, their silence accepting injustice. Our modern systems aren't so different. Every time workers unionize, tenants organize, or consumers divest, they're pulling the same lever the Candlemakers discovered, the one labeled "you need us more than we need you." As the screen fades on this chapter of history, don't just close the book, carry its spark forward. Share this story with someone who needs reminding that change isn't just possible, it's been done before, by people no more extraordinary than you. Hit like if you're inspired by these unsung heroes, subscribe for more tales of forgotten courage, and drop a comment about which modern movement reminds you most of the Wax Rebellion. Together, we'll keep lighting the way, one story, one action, one shared flame at a time.